Hello,
Hello,
I'm Alex,
I'm Val.
and we're here to talk about Sopranos.
Season 3, Episode 3.
Fortunate Son.
That's what we're going to talk about.
Yep.
So, I haven't said this one in a while.
Mm-hmm.
What we do on this podcast is we watch
Sopranos.
each episode, and then immediately, and we write notes while we do it,
Mm-hmm.
which maybe you don't need to know. But immediately after we watch it, we go and we just talk about it. So these are usually, although we've seen the show multiple times, these are usually kind of preliminary thoughts in some ways. Some things we've worked out a little bit over the years of watching it,
Yeah.
but other things we're still kind of working on or figuring out.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of our ideas have kind of come together over the many, many times we've seen the show and over the years of thinking about
But
it. and
I still feel like
talking
I'm
about
getting
it.
new things on this
Always.
watch. So that's the thing. Like, that's what I'm
Always.
saying. Like, some of them
That's-
are like ideas we've had for a bit and some of them are new.
Yeah, I think the show is always giving, and interpretations of it are always changing based on when you watch it. I mean, I think it always
Yeah.
brings different things out of you depending on where you're at.
Yeah,
And-
we've talked about that before, I
Yeah.
guess, too. But yeah,
Mhm.
anyways, that's just what we do here, just in case.
Just in case you're
Just in case you
just
thought this
jumping in at
was-
season
yeah.
3, episode 3.
Well, just
You
in
never
case
know.
you thought that, a podcast should have fully formed thoughts and scripts.
Mm-hmm. Well,
This one doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're here to talk about it.
Yeah.
And where do you want to start?
I don't know. Maybe you want to start by talking about Christopher.
It's okay. Interesting.
Because I feel like this is a really Christopher episode.
Oh, interesting. I actually
Yeah.
probably wouldn't have said that going into
Okay.
this, but I'm interested in
Well,
that perspective.
Whose episode is it for you?
Hmm.
Because we'll probably talk about that person.
I think indirectly it's I think it's a kind of an ensemble episode.
Yeah.
It's dealing with a lot of characters, but invisibly kind of I feel like it's Tony's episode.
Okay.
I feel like psychologically it's examining Tony quite a bit.
Okay.
It's not blatant. It's not necessarily in terms of like Tony's actions, but there's
No,
reflections.
I know
and
what
ways.
you mean.
But I mean, I think at the same time, I think that Christopher has key moments. Even Polly has key moments in terms of his interactions with Christopher, which gets expanded throughout this season and this series.
But it's important
Meadow,
in this
AJ.
episode.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Anyways, okay. I know. Yes, it's
Well,
an
let's talk
ensemble.
about Christopher.
But I want
I
to
like
talk
it.
about Christopher because
Yeah.
there were a few things with him that I think are like worthy of unpacking.
Okay.
I think something I want to pay attention to as we continue to watch Christopher's arc that I don't think I've really paid attention to before was how seriously he takes himself about being a made man.
Yeah.
So like in this episode, like we see how genuinely excited Adriana is
Right.
for him and how excited he is, right? And then the second that he's going to become a made man, he puts on this suit. And we don't see Christopher wear like classy stuff. We see him like he has those like tracksuits.
Yeah.
We don't see him wear a suit. And there's these amazing shots of him. There's a couple, like they're kind of like these down low shots. They make him look really big and really powerful.
Yeah.
Which again, we don't really see Christopher as that.
Well, interesting. I think you mentioned that in the first scene where it's in the parking lot where he meets Polly.
Yeah.
And interestingly, they also have some really interesting shots at the end of the episode.
Yes.
Some like really like virtuosic camera work actually where they're kind of like moving all
Sorry,
over the place.
who was the director of this episode?
Henry Bronstein.
Okay.
Sorry, Henry, if I pronounced your last name wrong, but
Bronstein.
Bronstein.
Have we seen
Written
him before?
by Todd Kessler. Yeah, he has directed
Okay.
episodes before. He's
No,
not
because I was
yeah.
pretty blown away by some of the camera stuff.
There's some cool things.
Yeah. But I think this one shot. Well, actually, there's kind of two shots of Christopher. They're kind of similarly shot, and maybe that's
Yeah.
why they stand out for me. But they really make like you don't really see him. At least I don't see him as this like super powerful character. He's kind of this like side guy, right? Like he like kind of does the dirty work.
Yeah.
And yet they really like they start to show him in these certain ways in this episode that actually like make him seem more powerful. He's scary. I mean, we know he's scary. We've seen him do scary things, but we still kind of like him. We think he's kind of gentle. I don't know. Like there's this impression of him. So by the end of the episode, so he goes to the episode wearing these suits. He doesn't want to be seen in the pizza parlor, right? He's like,
Ufa?
yeah, Ufa pizza parlor. He's like, I'm going to, I don't want to sound whatever, but I shouldn't be seen in places like this anymore, right? He's like really...
Well, then ultimately he goes back there, and that's where he gets his plan from Jackie.
He's really cocky, but we see after he loses, like he doesn't do well at the sports betting stuff, he's gone back to wearing not suits. He's like suddenly wearing his usual clothes, like a leather jacket and stuff like that too. So it kind of shows him trying to fit into this new world. I don't know, that he's not really like... again, maybe similarly to AJ, like he doesn't feel like he's good enough or part of this group necessarily. Yeah. He's kind of an outsider.
Yeah.
So I just kind of, and then the thing with the bird. So I actually I think one of the reasons that I really do like Christopher is that we see, I don't know, there's something like, we get some of his dreams, right? Which we don't get a lot of characters' dreams, but we do get his, right? Or we hear about his. He's kind of like, I don't know, he's a little like spiritual or something. Like he actually believes in some of these kind of out there things, right? Like he really believed his dream that he was going to hell, right? Or like these things really impact him. And the thing with the black bird on the windowsill, like that's a pretty, like, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for?
Ominous?
But like someone who believes in that kind of stuff.
Superstitious?
I guess so. Okay. Yeah, like superstitious, or like just like believe in some of these more like spiritual things. Yeah. I'll think of it later.
I like how the symbology kind of gets crossed too in this episode, where like Adriana is saying like, like, oh well, like the bird is death, not bad luck, and Christopher's talking about it how it's bad luck. It's just funny how they play on symbology in this show, because clearly it's a part of it, but I think they also kind of like break it down for people like us that are kind of getting into every detail, because they also, like, even in the last episode with Meadow saying to AJ, white is death, but so is black. So they kind of go all over the place with these things.
But I think he's just like he's such a, I mean, I've said this before that I think he's my favorite character. I just see him as just a really compelling character. I don't know, like the fact that he sees this bird and he really believes that that's like part of why things aren't going well. Like he's like, it's that fucking bird, right? Like he's upset, and Adrian has to like talk him down, be like, it's not the bird, like you're just having some bad luck, right? Like I don't know, he's crazy. Like I love it.
I think that there was some parts of this episode too that focused on Christopher's lack of a father too.
Totally.
And his lack of direction maybe as a result of that. There were some edits that I thought were really interesting. And even like in the beginning, Polly saying like, if you have any problems, you go to this man here, pointing to Tony. He's like your father. Yeah, we want
to talk about the Polly stuff. So, we'll talk about that little speech
but this is about Christopher.
Yeah.
Because there's also some cuts directly to AJ too, like when he's playing football, which I think is relevant, but there's an absence of a father figure for Christopher, and also there's a focus on Jackie and his lack of a father.
Yeah.
And I think that there's like kind of this like aimless action from the characters who don't have a dad. I think there's different problems for characters who have fathers that are in the mafia, even if they're trying to be caring for them. They have other issues. Like even we've seen Tony and his issues coming from a mob family and his relationship with his dad, Johnny Soprano. But I think there's definitely, in this episode, a major theme is looking at the relationship between sons and fathers, which is interesting because there's been so much focus between Tony and his mother. So that's kind of opening things up to a different angle right now.
Definitely. And I think, we don't know much about Christopher's father, right?
We find out a lot more later.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So, that's something we have kind of a hole in our knowledge about, right? But we definitely see, I noticed that cut too when they were like, this man is like your father. I want to just talk about that scene where Chris is getting his button. Is that what he gets?
Yeah. He becomes a made man. Yeah.
I don't know about the button thing, but there were two things kind of. That speech, I think, is really an important one that Tony gives, right? Like, it really shows you very clearly, at least like what Tony says he believes in terms of family, like who comes first, right? So we talk about that a lot, like, you know, which is the family that he's really part of, like that he has these two families. He says outright, like, this family comes first. It's more important than your wife, your son, your daughter, your whatever, right? So that makes that really clear for us there. But I that cut to Christopher when it's like, this man is like your father, and Christopher kind of does this like almost like a small nod, right? He's kind of like, okay, I can, you know, and then he tries to learn from Polly, you know, like he actually like wants to have someone who's mentoring him, supporting him, kind of thing. So I thought that was interesting, that speech. But then the other thing that I noticed, it like struck me while watching the episode, so I thought it was kind of important. When Christopher's coming down the stairs into the party, the button party,
button party,
whatever that is.
What a sweet party.
It is sweet. The scene, so they come down the stairs and like Syl and Tony and Christopher come down. I think that we see them in that order, and it's like an exact parallel of the scene where they go down the stairs onto the boat when they're about to kill Pussy.
Yeah.
And we know that Chris kind of has these fears about, like, he's a little bit paranoid about going to this thing, right?
Yeah.
They have him sit in the front seat.
Yeah.
They don't tell him where he's going, right?
Yeah.
So he's a little scared too. And as was Pussy when they were bringing him there too. He knew that, like, things weren't
Well, also,
great,
there's a
right?
Goodfellas, like, within Goodfellas, Joe Pesci's character is killed when they say that he's going to be made, too.
Right.
So I thought it was funny, too, how they reference the movies. Like, when it's funny because Chris says to Adriana, like, you've been watching too many movies. And then Tony says to Chris, you've been watching too many movies. Which is amusing because not only of Chris's background with screenwriting and his draw to the movies, but also the kind of, like, outside gangster references of this show to Goodfellas, and the fact that that actually happens in probably like one of the biggest, I don't want to say influences, but one of the movies and pieces of film that like sets up Sopranos maybe more than anything else.
Right. So we have in that scene where we have them coming down the stairs then at the party, you know, we know how Chris feels. We see them come down the stairs in this exact order of person, which I think is like basically the same. Maybe Pussy is in place of Christopher in that scene in Funhouse. But we see them come down the stairs and we actually hear this creaking sound. Like it feels like it, you know, it would be the creaking sound of the stair, but it's like exactly those sounds that we talked about in Funhouse that are these like creepy dock creaking sounds, which are the ones we said like we also hear in Godfather 2 and stuff like that. So I think that was purposeful. It really, like, at first I was like, are they on the boat? Like, it was that similar. It stood out as that similar to me. Like, just exactly like the curvature of the stairs even. Like, it was like, it was really like that. So I just thought that was interesting in terms of, you know, Christopher's trajectory. Because we, you know, there's always somebody who's going to be, you know, feeling like the underdog. Or I don't know, you know, like, so we can kind of contrast Pussy with Christopher, like any kind, you know, any of the made guys, right? Like what it's been like for them to come up from being Christopher, right? And what kind of mentorship they had, or what kind of like quote unquote father figures they might have had,
right?
So anyways, I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's even like room for these new made guys because it's a replacement. I mean, you know, we have somebody
it is, right? Like that's the thing. And so I think that scene was on purpose for lots of reasons. But.
Right. So I mean, there's a relationship between those two. They're tied between that now. Yeah, but I mean, I think in the episode there is so much focus on fathers, and it's you know, for instance, like at the very end, actually, it was interesting when Tony was talking to Polly. Polly came and said that Christopher got the information from Jackie about the game and that it was in the papers. Tony was saying, when's he going to grow up about Christopher? And then there was a really quick edit to AJ.
Right.
And there was a few other things like that, actually, about like important statements and then shifting to AJ playing football, which is particularly relevant because football is so important to Tony. And we talked about this in, you know, in previous episodes, and even in this season it's been coming up more. We talked about the like Letterman not jacket, but the insignia that he found in Prochai Lavushka. And even going back to the very pilot, Tony talking about the blow to his self-esteem from Junior, and that's something that just keeps on getting expanded, how important football is for Tony in terms of his psychology. So it's really interesting to see AJ in this episode like thriving in this football environment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually
in like almost a way that doesn't really make that much sense.
maybe.
Like, is he really worthy of being made captain?
You know,
for that one move.
I have to say, every time I've seen this show, I've always AJ's kind of like a bit of a take it or leave it character for me.
I know, you've said that before.
But this viewing, I'm not finding it
Good.
like that. And
I'm
I
glad.
actually find there's some really interesting subtle things about him that are really interesting as a character. And I think this episode is actually kind of a key episode. Just in terms of the pressures that he has, the father figure that he has, the direction that he would be, kind of directed towards, and also who he is as a person. Because I think there's a lot of undertones that they're developing now about him actually being kind of like a very philosophically inclined person.
Totally.
And I feel like he's just kind of like left out to sea in this family. Like there's nobody who can really understand those questions or can nurture him. So he's being nurtured in football, which is something that he's actually not really that interested in.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's just like this doomed certainty in this show of everybody repeating the mistakes of the previous generation.
But it's a point that he and Tony can connect on, though.
Yeah.
And so, like, and you can see, like, when they go to Stewart's, for example, or, like, Tony's like, let's go to Stewart's, you know?
He wants to play video games.
Yeah.
When are you going to toss that thing out the window?
But then he's like, and let's go to Stewart's. Then we actually don't see them there, right?
No.
But, like, it's clear that they're kind of bonding over this. But, you know, like, I don't think AJ would have chosen it otherwise if there wasn't kind of like, because I think you're right. I think he really can't connect on any of these. Like, even with Meadow, like, Meadow kind of sees things as, like, he was asking for her interpretation of the poem, and she gave him kind of like a textbook answer in some ways too. Like, I don't know. We also see him like staring out, like we see him like looking a lot, right?
know.
So we have him like
And
staring
actually
out
looking
the window.
out like through the window, like at greenery, which in season 1 we talked so much about. They're establishing that as kind of like the eternal, the afterlife.
Yeah.
It's one of these images that the show keeps on coming back to.
No, exactly.
Even those dinner scenes, the way that it's framed is like the
With the
window
green
with
all
all the
around
greenery
him.
behind
Yeah.
is really exaggerated.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and and like staring out on the college campus, like we really see him like in thought, right? And we don't know what his thoughts are necessarily, but we see him like considering the things around him.
Yeah.
I also saw him as like considering his options in life, right? So one of the times where he's staring, it's when like Ralphie's there, like he's like looking out at the mob guys outside. I forget what they were doing at the time. The other time he's staring is at the college campus, right? And then he comes to like, that's not for me.
Right.
Right. But he doesn't like necessarily like outright say that about the mob life. Right. Like, I think like he sees Christopher getting made. Right. Like he sees like that is kind of he sees Jackie Jr.
Yeah.
Right. So like that is a possible option for AJ. It's not.
Maybe, except Tony actively wants
to
for that
keep
to
him
not happen.
Totally, but we see that that's not always gonna, you know, like, and we see that almost with the stuff with Meadow, right? Like he doesn't. Once kids grow up, he doesn't have control over them.
Yeah.
You know, and even with like a Jackie Jr., right? Like he can't control them just because he's their dad / their dad's friends / the godfather.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like I don't think that's the path that AJ will go. I don't see that for him, but he's like looking at his options in this episode.
Definitely.
And I think being quite pensive about what that would mean for him.
Yeah.
You know, and how he would fit in.
Yeah.
Too. Like I don't see him like thinking that he would fit in the mob life either.
Right.
You know. So maybe he's just kind of lost. I mean, like maybe he sees himself as not fitting in either.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
There was a couple lines like Artie talking about their sons. They're closer to us than we were to ours. I feel like there's this theme in this episode of the differences in relationships between generations and how it's changed at that time, like the early 2000s, like at that time there's a big difference between the culture of when Tony grew up and the
Totally.
family relationships that they had. But Tony really does stress about how, he says, like, in quotes, like, I don't want it for my son either, when Jackie comes in to that scene with Artie. And then there's like a cut from that to the football.
Yeah.
And so I think Tony does, it's interesting. Tony, I think, does want to support AJ in a way that he wasn't supported. His family did not fully support his football habit. Unfortunately.
Football habit.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's not what is correct for AJ. But Tony is ill-equipped to actually help him find his
do
correct
anything
path.
else. Yeah.
And even like, it's about Tony, right? So like when he's there and there's that slow-mo scene, like we see how happy Tony is when he finds out, and AJ sees that.
Yeah.
But then, after, and that's important, but then after like Tony says like, that's my son, to the two guys in suits.
Yeah, they're all wearing suits.
Well, in particular, those two guys who actually, Tony was like yelling like, it's the rules.
Yeah.
But there's something that identifies them as like outside of the mob world, and like Tony is like impressing or something, or like trying to assert success, prove himself.
Yeah.
Maybe to these people that he feels like he's been unable to fit in with, like those kind of like regular folk.
Well, the funny thing about those folk, and we'll come back to AJ in a second, but it's them who are like making a big scene and yelling at the ref. Not those two guys in particular, but like all the other
others,
dads who are there wearing suits, because they all are, except for Tony and the garden shop guy.
Right.
What's his name?
Oh God.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
Guys.
And the garden
But
shop
if you didn't
guy.
catch it, if you go back to season 1, the fight that AJ gets into, it's his dad.
But it kind of like actually shows Tony being more of like a natural football dad kind of thing. Like he's there, he knows the rules, he knows the whatever, right? Like he speaks that kind of language. I don't know. But then AJ, like, so I like that, like, you really do see AJ like taking that in, and he doesn't get a ton of approval, AJ, you know, so that would be important for him. I guess the question that like I'm left with after this episode is, and we talk about kind of this transmission from father to son a lot in this episode, obviously, but we know that Johnny Soprano had fainting spells, right? We don't really know like what's the story, like when he fainted? Do we know anything about that? Like what the situation was when he fainted?
Oh, so Hesh tells him, but I don't know if we really know that many
I don't think we know. I just know we know that he did faint.
Yeah.
Right? So we can't figure that one out. We're starting to understand what makes Tony have these panic attacks, right? We'll talk maybe more about that.
Maybe. Yeah.
We're starting to like
some triggers.
There's, maybe have one theory of an idea about why that's happening. But we're starting. That's like the show is starting to explore that, right?
Yes.
But at the end of the episode, of course, we have AJ passing out after he's been made defensive team captain. So what's AJ's thing, right? Like, what is AJ's kind of like trigger or this thing that he'll have to deal with, overcome, or whatever it might be? Because I couldn't quite figure it out. Like, was it about that? Like, the coach said like he's a leader and he'll go far, or like something, something along those lines. Was it about the football? Like, was it about football that like this is where he's going to end up, and like that's panicking him?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's a hard one, but I mean, perhaps some possible interpretations. I mean, all those things refer to his father. So I mean, like being a leader, and also like being successful and being promoted in the football environment.
Right.
Like perhaps
it's
that's
like
not.
It's like getting made.
Maybe, but maybe that's not. Maybe that's not what he wants or what he's interested in. In fact, if we can judge only from the contemplative side of him that we see in this episode, football likely is not where his passion is. And so maybe there's an because there's so much focus on football in this episode. There's so much football on the TVs. There's talk about football.
Well, there's all the betting, about
there's
football.
All the betting. There's a link to football in the flashback.
Junior has,
even on the radio.
Johnny has the paper on his, like it's like a sports section.
Yeah.
When he's sleeping.
Yeah. No, there really is a lot. And so I think there is an aspect of that is something that is relevant to Tony as a character, and maybe it's transferring down to AJ.
We have yet to see more about Tony's past in football.
Tony's past in football. Oh,
Yeah.
right. That's right. Yeah, there's more coming.
Yeah.
Even like it was interesting, like in the session with Melfi at the end, where she was so excited because she's able to kind of come up with a theory, and she says, "I'd really like it if you could write down any thoughts or associations." And then there's an edit to football on TV. So like they're talking about the meat, which
interesting.
is something that I'd like to talk about.
Oh, I see. That's so smart. I wrote that down. I was like, look to see if like Tony has any weird like associations or thoughts, like if we see him jump from thing to thing.
Right.
Ah.
Yeah.
Good one.
No,
Good
totally.
one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think meats
Yeah.
and football in this episode are really huge. And that's fascinating because those both show up in the flashback. In fact, the flashback is set up where they're in the car and they're actually talking about football. And there's so much talk about it's our busiest season in this episode.
Yeah, they say
and
it
you
so
get,
many times.
They set it up in a way where you feel in the flashback that it's the same time of year.
Yeah.
The dad is in the same environment.
Yeah.
They're dealing with football. And those things just kind of keep on coming back. So Tony obviously did not escape this cycle. It's a repetition of what was happening with his own father. And so it's amazing, actually, that edit from the Melfi scene, associations and...
I was all caught up in writing my notes down. That's really good.
all your meat thoughts.
Well, no, I was writing down look for thoughts and associations.
Well, that's one.
No, I think that's really good. I mean, like, it's not by chance, right, that like we see a father and a son. Well, we talk about Tony passing out over the meats. Well, I guess we see him passing out over the meats in the past, but then we see AJ passing out at this football, right? So there is again this like continuation. We see lots of Tony and AJ eating together, right?
Yeah.
So we know that there's that food element for both of them. So interesting. I like it.
Yeah. Well, maybe it's time to talk about meats.
Let's talk about meat.
Meats or meat?
Meats.
Okay.
Well,
I thought it was funny, actually, like right away, almost at the beginning of the episode, when Tony's talking to Carmine and Johnny Sack is there, there's actually like a pretty significant focus on like the spread, the plates of meat. So it was kind of just like setting up the whole episode because, there's with Melfi talks about focus on this connection between anxiety attacks and meat, which is so specific. And then shortly after, Tony with Ralph and Chris, they're grilling sausages again, which is something that Melfi actually directly confronts. She says, like, wasn't that your first panic attack? Tony's just like, how do you remember these things? And going back to the pilot, like we have a panic attack at the barbecue with all these things. And, going when he goes to the house and Svetlana's there, he asks, does Janice leave any food in there? Svetlana says no, but I have orange juice, which is obviously funny given what we've talked about with the representation of orange juice to death. But immediately he goes in, and this is, I think, as heavy-handed as the show gets. And maybe it's even intentional to kind of hit us over the head so hard that we have to kind of question that we're getting true answers from anything like this. Because I think there is an aspect of ambiguity that always overrules answers to the puzzle in this show. Because anytime you're watching and you feel like you've kind of like solved it, I think that's kind of missing the point because everything is presented in an ambiguous way and it's always supposed to be ambiguous. So when you go in there and you see him pull out and there's two things and it says capicola, sausage, and then it goes to the flashback and we have a thing about, Johnny Boy Soprano and the meat and bringing it home, and Melfi tells us. For me, it's fascinating and probably true in some regard, and we have gone deeper into Tony's character, but there's also kind of there's warning bells or something for me when like Melfi is like telling us what to think.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because I think it's like the most surfacey parts of the show.
Yeah.
And I think that this show has so much to decode, but like when they actually come out and tell us it, I feel like there's a lot more going on.
No,
the
I think so.
too.
Here, I think that's kind of the point of this episode is like that you can't. These are things that you can't necessarily explain away. Like we have this conversation with Carmine where he's talking about his son with seizures, right? Like that's one possibility.
Yeah.
We have Melfi just like having this long conversation about her 3-pronged approach, right? And so it shows you already that there's this like other perspective that like someone who does CBT with Tony right, would get this totally other perspective or theory on him.
Yeah.
Right? That they're only doing two of the, like, that's only one of these possible three prongs that are actually, like, making a difference for him, right? So I thought that was kind of linked into that. But yeah, I think that's what this episode explores, is, like, how much we kind of crave an answer like that, but then also how unclear those type of answers are, or that there's these holes in them, like, why can Tony sometimes grill meat without passing out, like we see him do in that scene with Ralphie and those guys. Anyways.
Yeah. It is a bit of a gold mine, though. They do really give us a lot in that flashback.
Yeah. I mean, I wrote down, like, meat, because we've talked about, like, meat and food and violence, and I think Sopranos Autopsy talks about that as well. He talks about that kind of connection too, but I think the other connection here is to sex, and I can't quite figure out that one in light of some of the other characteristics in this show, but definitely that was something that was part of that. I think, at least, like, reading into the character, like, and reading into the filming, that kind of, like, sexuality between his parents was part of it too.
Yeah.
Now I can't really put my finger on why that's, like, you know, why that's salient for him or why that's really impacting him, but I think that's also connected to the violence, to the meat.
I think so. And I think, actually, for me, part of it,
and why Svetlana's in this episode.
Well, okay,
Anyways,
so let me, I mean, with sex and violence and the foods that are related, I think, again, like, they really come out and actually make some statements that actually give us more clear clues than we get at almost any other part of the show. But, you know, saying violence and blood so closely connected to the food you eat, from Melfi. Which is, again, you know, like, you can find that in analysis of the show, but this is actually an instance where the show is just basically coming out and saying that. They are linking that and talking about the psychological implications of, and for me, Melfi also says, like, where the meat came from. Your mother's delight from it. One day you would have to bring home the bacon, right? And for me, I think the aspect that connects all these things is the meat is coming home. So it's entering the domicile. It's like Tony is seeing the connection between violence and food so directly at Satrial's, where he actually, like, cuts off Satrial's finger. That food, the meat, is coming home. They're eating it. You know, you have the kind of, like, sexual scene where Johnny, like, has the, like, blood on his finger that Livia licks, or, you know,
it's like juices.
Or juices from the roast. But for me, even, like, singing All of Me, which is a song about, you know, like, taking all the limbs.
Yeah, that was creepy.
I mean, that's not the original intention, but there is something literal about that. But for me, I think it comes down to that casual violence, that behavior has been taken into the home. Tony is innocent at that point. He's a child, but that's entered into his home life and his upbringing, and so it's hard to escape from that.
Right.
And I think that his parents' relationship, it's all intertwined with violence, and you can't separate yourself from it.
Yeah, I think Tony's, like, forever changed by that moment. Definitely. I think that was the first time, like, you know, we have we have Janice coming to terms with her dad a little bit earlier, right? In, like, the other flashback that we got, you know, where she's going with him to the circus, but it's actually whatever kind of mob activity is going on. Right? But I think, like, that's the first time we see Tony coming to terms with this. And we know that it's important to him that AJ's not involved. And we know, like, he says that a bajillion times, right? We know he, like, sees himself as this certain, like, kind of football father kind of thing. Like, he has this image of himself and his son plays football and that's my son. Like, so yeah, I don't know. There's like, there's something that moment is clearly important. Now, does it explain all of his panic attacks now? That I'm not, again,
no, but
that
perhaps
I'm not
it's
sure on.
a trigger amongst others.
Totally. I just wanted to say one more thing, one more meat reference.
Please.
Adriana was making cheese dogs for Christopher before he had to go to his button party.
Oh, cheese dogs.
Different kind of meat than the nice meat delivery that Livia gets.
Right.
But
yeah. I mean,
cheese dogs.
Yeah. I think, I mean, it's so related from this, like, what's passed on from father to son and what's kind of inescapable. I thought it was interesting too, when Johnny was talking to Tony and giving him kind of like a lesson, saying the man is a gambler, about Montreal. He avoided me. You should never gamble, Anthony. What am I supposed to do? That's my livelihood. So there's a couple interesting things there. First of all, that line, when he starts saying, what am I supposed to do? That's my livelihood. I actually think there's more words than that, but it's actually verbatim what Tony says to Dave Scatino in season 2.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's obviously internalized those lessons. And also, as the show goes on, Anthony's relationship with gambling becomes something that the show examines. So they're also setting something up in that flashback for something that will be investigated later on, because Tony does actually have moments where he's gambling.
Spoiler.
Huge spoiler. I'm really sorry. But it's true. He does gamble at times.
Wow.
Which is interesting because that's directly something that his father didn't want him to do.
And that he currently has very strong opinions on. Like, that's part of the reason why he feels okay taking money from a lot of these people.
Yeah.
Right? And he says it about Dave Scatino. He's like he has this like moral superiority over gamblers somehow.
Right.
So he like really has these strong beliefs about it.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see and that's something his father taught him to be.
Right.
So then to like actively go against something that was taught to you by your father, especially his complicated relationship with his father, is an interesting kind of like character change. But I guess we'll talk about that in the future, since you're really just talking about a spoiler.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
There was also actually, when Tony was watching the football game with AJ, I thought it was interesting when AJ and Carmel end up leaving and he's just left there with all the junk food and he's just kind of watching. Yeah, there's something about the unhealthiness of that situation, and for me it's like the only reason why he's there is his own actions. Like, he has alienated himself and he's left there in that kind of like unhealthy environment. And that like, he can't have that family relationship as a result of, the things that he's done.
Can we talk for a second about what a douche Noah Greenbaum is? Or what's his name? What's his last name? Greenbaum?
Oh, you messed me up. It's unimportant.
Oh. What?
Tannenbaum.
Tannenbaum. Okay. Whoops.
That's okay.
Man, that guy's the worst.
I didn't get that for many viewings. Now I do get it. Yeah.
And Meadow's kind of the worst also.
I love how the way she talks changes.
Yeah.
You can see her internalizing like who she's around.
Yeah.
Even the way she talks about like, oh, like we're going like to the whatever it is, like the vacation
the NBC
spot. They work for NBC. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating, her shift too.
Because that's not coming from, New Jersey and the Soprano family. There's something new in there.
No.
And you can almost just see like Noah, like
Columbia.
the family that he's from. Like, you can kind of get a feel for like what they would be like.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a great scene though. And Carmela in that scene is so complicated. She has like multiple feelings and like she's like pulled to kind of multiple sides.
Yeah.
Anyways. Yeah. And like you could tell that she also has kind of like, she shares some opinions with Tony, right? When she's like, Noah, like, how it is coming from an interracial family or whatever. Like, that must have been difficult for you. And he's like, what? But, like, so she doesn't quite get it either.
Right.
But she's also invested in, like, making peace between Tony and Meadow, So I like that scene.
How about Janice with Svetlana? There was some interesting... For me, I liked it when she was talking about how it's an emotional issue for her. And... she wanted to show her how much they mean to Janice, to her.
Right.
Which is interesting because in in previous episodes, she was talking about how they'd be worth so much to the right collector.
Of course.
So
of course.
Another example of Janice just kind of emotionally manipulating people.
Yeah.
But Svetlana's a little bit more savvy than some of the others.
Oh, yeah. She's smart.
She's pretty aware. Yeah. And as soon as she comes back, she's not having any of the bullshit.
Yeah. I forgot that this story, because this, leg issue, I forgot that it spanned over more than one episode.
Right. Yeah. We also see her knight in white satin armor.
Yeah, Bill.
He's there.
He's just like the most
Bill guy.
The most Bill guy I've ever seen.
The most Bill.
Yeah, he says like one line
Yeah.
It's really great.
In the flashback, I thought the shots of like the cleaver actually coming down was interesting because there's actually like specifically things about cleaver later on.
Well,
in
even
the
just
show.
the positioning of it.
Yeah. Actually, it reminded me of some things that are coming
Yet
up.
to come.
Yeah. And that last song, weird song, but the song about the sad clown, turning frown upside down for dough.
For money.
Yeah, I mean, weird song. But,
It was a really weird song. That's one of the weirder ones I've heard.
But it was interesting in terms of the relationship to Tony earlier on in the show in season 1, talking about feeling like a sad clown and maybe thinking about how doing all these things for dough, for money, like how he has kind of like taken this midnight train to to reference some lyrics in the end of the show, but he's kind of followed through on actions for money, and maybe it's gotten him out of, well, he's felt like a sad clown, but he's been kind of like continually drawn for money and kind of sold his soul in the process.
Yeah.
And obviously in psychotherapy it still comes out that he has these difficult feelings. But anyway, it was interesting just to think about the lyrics there.
Totally.
It's funny sometimes in this show for the kind of like complicated and nuanced levels that are always happening. Sometimes actually I feel like in the songs it's very literal. Like
super literal.
Like extremely literal. Like they actually kind of have a penchant for like choosing songs where you can just kind of take things at face value. And
that's why I don't know like how they found this really weird song.
Yeah, good question. Well, next episode is a pretty pivotal moment for the show. So again, if you're thinking of stopping after this episode, maybe you should watch the next one.
I think that would be wise.
That would be wise. So thank you for listening, and we'll be back then. I'm sure we'll have lots to say.
Yeah.
We're looking forward to it.
Great episode.
See you then.
Bye.